Uh, hey Dan, what's
Boom.
happening, man?
Not much. Can you hear me okay?
Here, all right. How's it going?
Going well. Just hanging in there every
Good,
day. How about yourself?
good, good. Everything's good, right? We're doing more stuff on social media. Like it's always, people are starting to come back in, which is great. Doing plenty of telehealth too. We didn't talk about that. Doing a lot of telehealth, which is great. Did actually like 4 telehealth sessions today, so that's actually pretty cool too. So I'm finding, which is actually cool. How do you feel about the telehealth stuff? I'm actually loving it. I'm hoping that I like doing hands-on treatment too, obviously, but I am thinking like this is the first time from a physical therapy perspective that like I could be somewhat mobile, right? Like I could do something from my house if I'm on like I was joking with some. I actually have some students through Sacred Heart that we're doing I'm leading a project through that. I was like, this could be the opportunity where physical therapy could like I could treat somebody in Delaware, I could treat somebody in Florida, right? It's obviously the licensure thing and insurance and that's all the red tape. So it'll be interesting to see. I hope it sticks around.
I know, yeah. I like the idea. I think it definitely comes with challenges, given that it's a little tough to see what's going on. You're not really feeling what's going on. I personally feel like I've maybe missed a few diagnoses just because I couldn't put my hands on that person. So I think it has its, pros and cons. But what I think is really cool is you can help people from a distance, which is phenomenal. And I think from a physical therapy standpoint, it's, we're pretty much bound to working inside of, a building with other folks have to kind of get to where we are. And this is kind of doing two things. So for one, it's showing that, okay, well, maybe we can do some physical therapy, in different locations. And two, like it allows us to have a little more freedom maybe with our practice. So if maybe we do want to work from home one day a week or something along those lines, there's a potential for that as well as trying to help people from all over the place, right? So it's been neat, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's funny you actually brought that up. I had somebody the other day. She had a hip labral repair, and she's doing great. It was doing awesome. And she was like, now I'm having issues. She like kind of fell forward on it, and in kind of a weird way, like stumbled on it. And then I was like, well, let's check out the back. We did some stability stuff, and then it got worse. And I was like, hey, I need you to come into the clinic to look. And sure enough, it was just like some SI, like her right side, and actually it was like something that I would have not thought of had I, But then again, I was like, this is why I need you to come in, so I can actually see you. And now, like, I was like, I probably can manage this now telehealth, right? So it's like that idea of like maybe it could be something where the eval, the first, session or two, you have to be in person, but then the rest could be like a follow up that way. So I totally agree. Like from a lifestyle standpoint, I'm sort of like selfishly hoping it sticks around, but at the same time, I totally agree. Like that was one of those times where I was like, I need you to come in. I gotta put my hands on it for a second.
Yeah, the thing that freaks me out a little bit, and I just want to say what's up to Dave Philly. Saw a couple of names in there, TJ. Yeah, Travis. But yeah, I do like the idea of it. I think it's great. I think it's a little bit funky, a little bit wonky in terms of, does your license cross you over to work with someone in Texas, right? If you're from New Jersey or whatever it may be. So that presents some issues. But the other part is that I don't know that we've ever been forced to challenge that as much as we may at this point right now, being in a pandemic. So I don't know, maybe no time like the present. It'll be something that's kind of good that comes out of this.
So well put, man. I actually, like I said, that's what I challenged these students to do. Is I was like, and that's these four guys like having to do the legwork. I was like, look, red tape. That's the big thing we got to knock out first. I was like, because we could develop this whole project that's like outside state lines, and I don't want to find out like 4 months, like a month from now that by the way that's not legal. So it's like I
I
totally,
know.
and it's really a cool way to kind of like to challenge that and point, and that's never happened in my career, right? So I think it's kind of a cool way to chat about it and kind of go through that. So, but yeah, no,
Cool.
cool. So cool. Let's do some introductions. I definitely, obviously, you guys. My name's Brian Wolfe. I'm a physical therapist with Evolution Physical Therapy. I'm the president of our East Coast operations. We run all the East Coast. I run all the East Coast offices out here. I'm in Connecticut. I asked Dan to come on with me today because to talk a little bit about overhead mobility and CrossFit athletes, Olympic lifting, bodybuilding, that kind of stuff. And so I treat a lot of active. I've been a physical therapist for 10 years, and I treat a lot of active athletes. That especially a lot of athletes to go overhead. So Dan was an awesome choice, and I'm glad you'd be able to join me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on here. I'm pretty pumped.
Yeah, cool. Yeah,
Um,
I love obviously issues too.
yeah. Do you want me to tell you a little about my background, I guess? Let the listeners know, I guess.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, sure. I always say I've been a lifelong meathead. I just freaking love exercise in general, you know. That's really what got me involved with fitness initially. So when I graduated, I worked full time as a personal trainer and a strength coach for several years. And, I was just working with these folks that had pain problems, and, I would refer them to local physical therapists, and therapists would often say like, oh man, of course you hurt your back, you're doing kettlebell swings, like, or, oh, you were deadlifting. I'm like, well, this doesn't really make sense. And the other part is like, well, I want to kind of keep doing what I'm doing. I mean, is there a way to do it a little bit more healthy way? And, you know, after a while, I was just like, kind of tired of trying to find physical therapists, that can help my athletes. Like maybe I want to learn it myself. So that's the reason why I ended up going to physical therapy school. And, currently I practice in a pretty cool situation because, we're an out-of-network provider, which basically means I have total freedom to do kind of coaching, fitness, physical therapy, blend everything together. And my main aim is just to help people continue with their fitness in the healthiest way possible. So
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, no, I think that's the kind of thing that's fun to be able to do with different athletes, right? Like it's able to, whether it's, we joke, we bridge the gap between, I shouldn't say we joke, we try to bridge the gap between fitness and rehab, right? So it's like we do all that stuff. So injury prevention, physical therapy, all that stuff. So that's awesome.
yeah, for sure.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the overhead athletes. So I wanted to talk with you about some of the people that you see. So obviously our whole week, if somebody hasn't seen it for the listeners, is we're working on overhead mobility and stability this week and talking with particularly obviously going after very specific fitness guys, right? Like CrossFit athletes and Olympic lifting athletes and bodybuilding athletes, anybody with presses or cleans or snatches or anything along those lines. So talk a little bit about some of the common things and movement, some of the common pathologies that you can see and sometimes some of the correlates with some of the movement issues that they have.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the big things you'll start finding if you start looking through the research, the survey data that we have on, let's say, powerlifters, strongman, CrossFit, kind of the typical strength and fitness sports is that the shoulder is a big issue. Depending on the study you look at, sometimes it's ranked number one. There's been a few studies in the CrossFit population where the shoulder came out number one, most injured area. And first and foremost, like I love these sports, right? I competed for like 7-8 years in CrossFit. I competed at a high level of strongman. I really love these sports, so I'm not trying to hate on them. Plus, the risk of injury is not that huge in comparison to more contact-based sports, but the shoulder does seem to come out on top in a lot of these studies. So I think just the specific demands of the sport are just going to predispose the joint to having some injury, So.
No, I totally agree, and I think one of those positions where if you're going to hit end range positions like an overhead, like a snatch, or something like a jerk, where you're going to hit that position, you're going to be, and then especially with something like CrossFit, where you're going to be transitioning in something like a Fran, where you're going overhead quickly, and then you're going to pull really quickly, right? Even if you're doing something like a butterfly, that stability, if it's not there, and you're not, one of the classic things that I'll hear people say that kind of, I don't want to say drives me totally insane because I get where they're coming from, but the idea of like the butterfly pull-up is bad or like the kipping pull-up is bad. And I'm like, well, from a progression standpoint, if you're kipping to accomplish a pull-up and you can't do strict pull-ups, well, yeah, maybe that's something where there's a stability and strength issue that we need to work on, right? But having that strength and stability and that ability, they're just different movements. That's all they are. It's just a different exercise, right? Whether I do a deadlift to shoulder or ground to shoulder with a stone, right? Whether I'm going to do a ground to shoulder with a barbell. Well, I'm going to accomplish these things in two completely different ways. So if I go to do it and it's like, well, that means that strongman's not good for you because you hurt yourself this way. No, it just might be the technique I need to change, and I can't achieve that. I can't achieve that properly because of some sort of mobility or stability issue, or maybe my central nervous system's not ready for that yet, right? Like that's a big one I see is the new CrossFitter. I joke a lot of times, like I think for me the two populations I'll see a lot is like the new to CrossFit population or the like I'm pushing my performance population, right? Like I'm competing a lot. And I'm really getting to that point. So I've had the pleasure of working with some athletes that have made the games to the point where like they're just starting out brand new with CrossFit, and those are going to run a wide spectrum. Right?
Yeah, for sure. It's, I guess each sport has its own demands, and if you don't have the required mobility or stability, it can maybe open you up to some certain injuries.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about overhead at all? I don't know what you were looking to get into.
Yeah, let's talk. So let's talk a little bit about overhead specifically with shoulders. So like why shoulders are so susceptible. You know why? Why? All right. You know what? That's a good one. This is kind of why for some of the people that are on that may not be as familiar with CrossFit. Because I also find that some of the reasons why people don't love CrossFit or love Olympic lifting or something like that is because they don't necessarily understand what the differences are. Let's talk a little bit about the differences of like the overhead mobility or overhead athlete in CrossFit or like Olympic lifting or strongman's a great one, versus like say the typical like I go to Crunch or I go to Planet Fitness or I go to this like what does that overhead athlete demand in those specific sports?
Yeah, so I think let's use Olympic weightlifting, and CrossFit kind of falls into this because you use a lot of Olympic weightlifting. It requires tremendous mobility, and I think a lot of people out there saying that mobility is important for injury prevention, they get poo-pooed on just because there's not a lot of research showing that trying to stretch things helps to prevent injuries, and I totally get that. There's also not a lot of research that shows that having better mobility or stretching is going to help with your performance. But the other piece is that if you start looking at sports that actually require a ton of mobility for their performance, then yeah, having good mobility definitely correlates with your performance. So I think for Olympic weightlifting, it requires a ton of mobility, not just overhead, but in the ankle and the hip. So for a lot of folks, they just can't get into positions they need to for adequate performance, right? The shoulder is definitely one of those. So you'll find a lot of folks that haven't been Olympic weightlifting their entire life. They don't have the mobility to do it. Maybe they come into this sport in their 20s, 30s, 40s, or even later, and they just can't get into the positions they need to in order to perform the lifts first and foremost. Let's not even think about the injuries at this point, but they just lack that mobility to do the motion appropriately.
I totally agree, and I think one of the things I think all the time in terms of if I think of my days back in like I think my meathead days like Gold's Gym or Planet Fitness or any of that stuff versus now like more of my CrossFit training. I think also not only is that like that last part of like say like shoulder flexion. So if I got like 180 degrees of shoulder flexion, that's here, right? Versus I think you'll see somebody press, it'll be like that just to like 170, right? So you'll lose that
Mm-hmm.
a lot of end range motions. It's like, all right, so if you're doing a thruster overhead, you might not necessarily require that end range of 180 degrees, that proper stability there. But if you're doing a squat snatch and you're getting in that very end range position, not only at end range with your shoulders and overhead flexion, but also thoracic extension. You got to have good hip mobility, good ankle mobility. So these combinations, like I always tell people, like I feel like the degree of threshold of difficulty in the movements is going to correlate with a lot of different end range mobility and stabilities at multiple spots. So like the difference of, yeah, you might be able to have good shoulder mobility, so a regular power snatch or hang snatch is not a big deal. But as soon as you get into that full squat, all of a sudden it's a huge problem because now, you'll see, how many times you'll see this like hyper flex thoracic spine and they're trying to compensate with over shoulder flexion. So I totally agree. I think the level of difficulty and also the more complexity of something that's newer to somebody, has various reasons for why those things can get restricted.
Yeah, for sure. And that extreme end range of motion that you may have to have for a snatch, and obviously if you have better mobility downstream, it's not going to be quite as much, is tough on the shoulder joint. I mean, if you think about the shoulder, it's not necessarily designed to do what we're throwing at it, right? I mean, the ankle joint, the knee, the hip joint, they were designed to bear a weight all day long, every day, and maybe do a little running, jumping, changing direction. You can make the argument that the shoulder was designed to do some climbing, maybe a little bit of throwing, although if you look at the throwing literature, throwing tends to tear shoulders up quite a bit. And we're asking our shoulders to handle a lot of load, right? And we're doing total body movements like a snatch or a clean and jerk. So the ankle is maybe a little bit better designed to handle the forces of that as opposed to the shoulder. So I think that predisposes the shoulder just having a little bit more challenge with the movements we're throwing at it, right?
Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah.
I totally agree with that statement because I remember talking with one orthopedic surgeon and we were actually chatting about it and I was able to sidestep it before it got heated. But I remember one of the things that she was saying was she was like, "We're meant to only do this, never do that." And I was like, "Oh man!" I go, "This is where we're going to disagree. We're going to agree to disagree here because I just think that like when it comes to athletic performance, that overhead movement, like one, like let's even take it back to a regular ADL. Like if I just go to put plates in an overhead cabinet, like I'm meant to reach overhead. That's what changes us from walking on our hands, right? That's what we began doing. So just from the standpoint of like, hey, what can we do to strengthen and minimize those pathologies, right? That's something that, I totally agree. It's like, it's not the same. It's much harder to create more stability in that joint, right? So it's more about like, how can we do that? What efficiencies can we take advantage of? Because I just wrote this blog post on it this morning, was like the three major things I think about with overhead mobility and why it's important is like, overall efficiency and injury prevention, right? Because of that efficiency of movement, now we're going to increase your performance. And then third is just better aging, right? Like how many people have we seen as you go from your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, like, oh, I can't do that anymore like I could in my 30s. It's like, well, is that because you're not maybe it's something you're not practicing? Is it something that you need to continue to work on, right? Is there a true pathology that's happening here?
I know. I think about that all the time. I think that's I don't know, the $1,000,000 question is like, what is the right dosage of exercise that's going to allow me to age well, get stronger, not hurt my shoulder? And when is that dosage too much and it pushes me over the edge and I start getting more pain, pathology, wherever it may be, set myself up for long-term failure? I don't have the answer. Do you know the answer to that one?
Actually, funny enough, from a physical therapy perspective, there's not a ton of literature on that, right? Like, there's not a ton of literature on like that dosage. However, CrossFit's actually trying to come out with stuff like that. So CrossFit came out, and it's a course I like to take. When I took the CrossFit Level 1 stuff and some of the other CrossFit courses, one, they preach a ton of technique, which is super cool. That's what I was more blown away with when I took those courses, was just like their attention to detail, which I thought was great. But then two was actually one of the people that I spoke with she was a CrossFit owner, affiliate owner down in New Jersey, and she talked about how they just started this CrossFit Masters class, and the whole idea was actually exactly that. They're trying to nail down dosage of exercise, right? So the difference I'm telling, so my guys more, some of my masters athletes that are in their 50s that are having like, now I just for the first time heard it called weightlifter shoulder. I just know obviously like AC joint issues, right? So like whether it's a little bit of arthritic condition, whether it's a sprain, of some kind, whether it's a hypomobility, whatever. And then AC joint, right? Classically, like reaching across the body hurts, right? Or like the big one in CrossFit is burpees, right? People say burpees, I want to die, and people are like, I'll get out of burpees anytime, right? So I can do it. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about that was they talked about instead like limiting overhead for cuffs, particularly was like, hey, we know that this degeneration is kind of a natural aging process. Like as we get into our 40s, 50s, 60s, and cuffs are very susceptible to injury with overhead athletes. So what we're going to talk about is like, hey, limiting your repetition. So not so much limiting the weight, but say like, all right, if you're and per week. So kind of like going based off a week is, say you're going to do Fran one day, right? Like that, we use that example. So that's 45 overheads, right? In that workout, right? And then the next, 3 days later, with the programming, maybe the programming had snatches involved in it, right? And then another programming had clean and jerks. It's like instead is almost like trying to, like almost putting people on, like almost like a pitch count, essentially, right? So you do the baseball, right? So I remember when I played a lot of baseball growing up, right? So playing baseball, it was right around that like that certain like 12-year-old age. It was like you couldn't throw more than 70 pitches or a certain amount of innings per week and things like that. Like same thing. Like, hey, you get 70 reps overhead this week, right? So that was kind of the thinking, is like, so that's actually what they're working on now. I don't know the exact answer to that, but I'm working on like kind of playing with that with some people. So I was like, hey, maybe the difference is you don't necessarily not need to worry about heavy. But if you're going to think about like that rep count, including practice reps, including whatnot, right? Like maybe that's around 70, 80, 90 reps, depending on your age and whatnot. So that's a cool algorithm to crack. That'd be a very cool thinking.
Yeah, for sure. Not to kind of switch gears too much, but I think that's a major thing that CrossFit coaches should think about with their programming. In the sense of counting the reps from week to week to week. I actually wrote CrossFit programming for, 4 or 5 years, something along those lines. And that was a big thing that I was very much into, especially overhead, because we're going to make sure that we're being consistent from week to week. So based on a lot of research by Tim Gabbett, we believe that fitness is protective. So you have to prepare yourself, right? You have to prepare your body for the demands of whatever you're doing. That comes challenging because the more often you expose yourself to a stress, the more likely you are to get hurt, right? So it's just like, all right, how do I balance throwing stress on my shoulder in a way that prepares me to get me stronger without doing too much and getting hurt? And one of the easiest ways to do that was to count your repetitions overhead. And I would count my repetitions in all planes of motion. So I think that like a kipping motion or pull-up motion is going to be very different stress in the shoulder than an overhead press. You know, one week you may find that you went overhead 300 times. That first week you went overhead pressing 250 and pulling for 50 reps. And then the next week you flipped it and reversed it. And now you just had a very strong stimulus to some muscles that aren't necessarily prepared for the force you're throwing at them. So I think that's a really tough task for CrossFit coaches because we throw so many movements at our athletes. It's very, very hard to keep track because CrossFit has created this culture of loving so much variation in movement and workouts, which in a lot of ways is good, but it makes it very challenging as well. So I think that's super important, just making sure you're thinking about that from a program perspective and as an athlete too.
That is so well put, man. I couldn't agree more with that. It's because I think I tell my athletes regularly, like, I'm like, hey, one of the things that you got to realize is like CrossFit coaches they are programming for the class, right? So they're programming for the whole group. I said it's very difficult to tease out individual people for that, right? So if you're doing the whole class, you're doing the whole group that way, right? It's really important to understand that the person's not. Oops, I'm losing my camera there. The person's not realizing that, hey, one of the things we could do is for Tim over there, we need to limit the overhead movements, and for Steve over there, we need to limit some of the squat stuff. And for that, you know what I mean? Like they don't understand your past medical history. They're not taking a detailed history of every single person. That's just because of the nature of group training, right? If you got 200 members in a gym, it's not going to be possible to do that with every single person. You know what I mean?
No.
So I
Well,
think.
that's
Yeah,
yeah.
so I think the idea of where I think physical therapy really comes in is like, hey, we can really help fill in those gaps and like make it so that you can make, like what you just talked about, that you can do that more intuitively and not have to make it a guessing game, you know?
You got it. And I feel like that's been like half of my career is trying to help problem solve some of those specific issues, both when pain's involved or when you just have a past medical history. So I guess for listeners that aren't familiar, if you have a shoulder injury, right, and you've had it a couple months ago and it's gotten better, you're more likely to experience shoulder pain at some point in the gym now, right? So what that might mean is that the programming that's written for you on the board is not necessarily going to be the best for you, right? So either the athlete needs to figure out how they can modify themselves, or the coach has to be able to do on the fly, right? Because you're in a group full of 20 athletes with all individual needs. How do I make that modification on the spot very quickly, right? And move on to the next person, just like I might make that small technical change with your snatch. Okay, bring the knees back, perfect. Move on to the next person. Okay, let's reach overhead a little more, great. You know, okay, your shoulder is bugging you, let's switch this modification, good, and move on to the next person. It should, in my opinion, be a skill that coaches are taught how to do, just like how to coach any other movement, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting because we even went into at one point in this gym that we're in Darien. One of the things that we tried at one point was like almost 3 levels of programming, right? So like, you know, this particular level, if you were here, you did this on this day, and if you were here, you did this on this day, and if you were here, like, and so on. And so I think that's challenging because now you're writing 3 different programs, right? You're essentially, so not only you're writing 1 program a day, you're writing 3 basically programs a day. And I definitely, when I first saw that, I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. That's just super time consuming and difficult. And then the other part you get, and I'm going to put it on members, and I don't know if any of them are watching, I haven't paid attention, but in terms of I'll tell you the big one is then also members being like, you know what, I'm going to do my level, right? Like I'm going to do my level. I'm not going to jump up to that level, right? So telling people, so I tell people too, like, and I'm sure you'll see, you've seen this too, is checking the ego at the door, right? So the idea of essentially being like, hey, if I'm walking to the gym and I know that, you know, 45 pull-ups is a problem for me, scaling to 15.96 or 15.93 for Fran on that day to get the actual, like, the you know, I preach this all the time, the intention of the day, right? What's the intention of today's training, right? Whether that's our athletes at like our pro level to our new athletes, like what's the intention of today, right? Is it the cardiovascular thing? Is it a quick hitter, right? Are we going to try and do something fast where we're laying on the floor at the end, right? Is it a long endurance thing? Is it a 60-minute, right? Are we doing like a 60-minute triathlon, right? Are we doing and I'm going, because you're going to address that differently, right? I don't want to, if I'm going to do a 40-minute AMRAP, I was like, I certainly don't want to try and be the guy who just won the first round of it, right? Like that's a recipe for a disaster if you're competing at that. So I think a lot of it is like the intention of the day is really important. I found that sometimes helps put people in the right mindset. So And then now, like, I think the big thing too that I know a lot of gyms do or don't do, and I've seen is like what the RX weight is, right? Like, is this a specific thing? Because I think from a self adjustment standpoint, some people may be more intuitive to that than others, right? So like some people might, think of that as like, oh, like this is something that that I should be doing, right? Or even what, like, what's another one that I think all the time is what is a good modifier, right? So like, Brian, I'll get that all the time. Brian, the burpees kill my shoulder. What can I do in the meantime? It's like, all right, well, what's the intention of burpees other than like, gassing your shoulders, right? Okay, well, if we're going to do that, like, let's have it. Is it a like, again, what's the intention of the workout? Is it cardiovascular? All right, well, then even switch to something like split jumps, right? Or something like, like jump squats, or something like that. So we're getting the other side of it, right? Maybe something that's like not a non-traditional type of CrossFit, or even saying, now at that point you're going to hop on the rower or the bike and just blast it out 10 calories, right? So sometimes I've realized like that's another big piece that we come into that I've done also that I think is super cool.
Yeah, I really like that idea. It's like if you're doing a burpee, the goal is not necessarily, okay, I need a movement that's going to stress my shoulders. It's like, all right, well, I'm actually throwing the burpee in the workout, so I want your heart rate to spike, right? How else can we spike your heart rate that's easy on the joints? Hop on the bike, blast out, 5, 10 calories. We just accomplished our goal, and now your shoulder doesn't hurt. So awesome. We're doing a great job there.
Exactly, and that, also we're talking about like kind of like that pitch count with the overhead. I think you can kind of like modify that way, right? So it's like, hey, if it's like pull-ups, burpees, and some sort of cleans, it's like, all right, well, we know the pull-ups and the cleans aren't going to be bad, but we know that the burpees might hurt you. And I think where the first common thing will be, all right, well, then just do push-ups. So it's like, all right, well, that's the same mechanism that also might still irritate you, right? Or like, but it's not going to be intuitive to go to like, and also then now we just took out the cardiovascular piece. So we did that, right? So like you said, then it's like, hey, switch to something like I said, a rower, where now you still are stressing the shoulders, but you're stressing the posterior chain and you're able to get that cardiovascular piece. So I think
Yeah.
that to me that I find that actually almost more fun is like this idea of group planning, but also like individual kind of tweaking, and individual training. I particularly have gotten into that lately. It's like over the last like 6 months to a year. And found that that's something that's like a really great gap to fill. And then I love it because it keeps people in CrossFit, right? Like it's a very simple thing where how often I'll be like, oh, CrossFit's not for me. It's like, well, no, like it can be. You just might need, a little coaxing here.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big one. You got to do what's best for you and not what everyone else is doing. Sometimes it's hard, right? I think the psychological aspect's probably the toughest thing for most people. But yeah, you certainly can.
Well, and I think the other part is like with CrossFit is there's always like one of the things that I think is a love-hate relationship. Particularly, I love it more is the competition, right? Like, there's a leaderboard, there's a community, there's smack talking that's going to happen. So, well, if I had to do the calories on the burpees, like then I had to basically say, oh, well, today I didn't win the workout, right? It's like, well, again, what's the intention of today, right? You made the progression. If you're in the CrossFit games, we'll have a totally different conversation. But for the 99.9% of people that are just trying to stay active, healthy, and whatnot, like this is the way to go, right?
Yeah, for sure.
No, I totally agree. So, what I want to do is let's talk a little bit about some of the more like common pathologies you see in the shoulder joint with these overhead guys, and particularly some exercise that you like as like accessory work. Because we kind of talked about some different ways we tweak workouts, but what are some accessory works that you do, both from like a mobility and stability thing for specific pathologies, or just in general for specific movements for overhead stuff?
Yeah, for sure. I think you're probably going to see a decent amount of rotator cuff irritation, maybe biceps tendon irritation, some bursa irritation. So looking at a lot of tendon issues within the shoulder joint. I think the major reason for that is with all those motions. So when you're doing a bench press or if you're doing a jerk or a snatch, your rotator cuff has to fight hard to stabilize the ball in the socket well. I think with all the forces that the shoulder joint is taking over the course of time, the tendons can just wear and tear a little bit and they can become a little bit painful, right? I think on top of that, one of the things I was doing a lot of research on just this morning is you might be seeing a decent amount of instability in folks. And I think a part of this is because I was seeing more and more, I work a lot with Dr. Rocket, who's a local surgeon in Massachusetts, and he's the head doc for CrossFit HQ, I think. But he does a ton of capsular surgeries in folks that are just loose, and just kind of got me thinking like, oh, wow, we're going to end range a lot in shoulders, right? We're doing snatches, we're doing the backswing on kips, right? We're really taking the shoulder towards end range. And anytime you're going to an end range of motion, there's going to be a little bit more motion within the joint. And I think what may be happening is that you're taking athletes that maybe were overhead athletes at some point in their life and they've acquired a little bit of laxity, or maybe they were born that way, or we're actually taking high-level athletes and making them a little bit looser because we're doing so many really challenging motions as a result. And not that that's particularly bad per se. Again, it comes down to probably the dosage and the individual. But I think we're probably creating a little bit of laxity or looseness within the joint, which can expose ourselves to maybe a little more stress on the cuff, and getting more cuff irritation as a result. So I'd say those are probably the major ones I see. I mean, as well as the AC joint, like you're saying. But
that's a great point about the laxity. It's interesting because I think that it's interesting. Particularly like with butterflies, like I always feel it on the eccentric movement, like that's so like the kip up's fine. Then that, like, if you're not slowly controlling where you're fatiguing, that like the eccentric motion, like that jerk to that point, and so you'll get like you have decent bony stability superiorly. But if you think about kind of the way the shoulder joint's moving, right, and the way the biceps attaches, because I'll see the occasional, like, listen, we've also had the traumatic ones, right? Like, well, we've had somebody who blew out a pec doing a muscle up, right? So the classic chicken wing that comes over the top, or, something from the biceps is pulling on the labrum and then causes some irritation that way. And I love the way you said that, by the way. Irritation, right? That's so key. Like tears, right? So traumatic. It has to be like repaired. It's like, well, no, this just might be a natural aging process that you have. Like, we don't see my hair's torn with white hair as I'm getting older. It's like, it's this idea of like, hey, irritated, and whether it's the AC joints kind of lit up, or the bursa, or the rotator cuff, the labrum, the biceps tendon, right? A lot of it is I think we're asking it to do a lot of stabilizing motions at very end ranges. So with a lot of times if someone's hitting a big snatch and they're in that 200, 225 in that range, like those are small musculature that's working to accomplish that motion. Right. So for that or like you said, like a body weight movement, like a kip, I mean, I'm 190 pounds, like all of a sudden sweeping through that motion, right? Like I have to have the stability for that. So how can you create that stability? That's why so originally this week was all about overhead mobility. And the more as I started writing the content, to your point about that, I switched it to overhead mobility stability. If you catch those, time that point, because I agree with you. I think the central nervous system and actually, there's some, I've talked some of the literature, some of the people that I've seen more on social media versus like literature that's confirming a lot, is that idea of like I do a lot of PRI, and like a lot of the PRI stuff talks about the central nervous system's irritation and then limiting motion. So like, all right, I have a hypermobility, and so now I can't get to that end range because my body doesn't like that. And so now we go in, and as a PT, you come in, frozen shoulder, right? Let's just stretch it, and now we're furthering that instability that's actually causing that. And I remember there was a couple of physical therapists that talked about that. And all of a sudden, I started having patients blow up some balloons for some shoulder stuff, and all of a sudden they got all this motion, and I was like, all right, I don't know, this is wild. Particularly with the baseball guys, right? With what was the sleeper stretch, right? We do this 1,000 times in the beginning of my career, and then all of a sudden, I had one of these guys do that. And I said, "What?" I watched it on YouTube one time. I remember thinking, I was like, I don't know what that is, but I got to go to that course. I was like, so super, super interesting. I totally agree. So I find actually, kind of to reiterate on what we're talking about the exercises, a lot of times what I'll find that I'll do is like, so PRI, like the Posture Restoration Institute, it's like this idea of diaphragmatic breathing, right? The concept of like, there's asymmetries that occur because of that breathing with overhead athletes. And so if someone's limited with certain motions overhead, I'll actually first try and do some stability work with them, and try and desensitize the pain first and see what I'm kind of left with. Like, is there truly a pec tightness, right? Like that can happen with some of my muscle bound, like conversions to CrossFit, right? Used to be we joke the Long Island Strong, right? Like the guys who bench and forearms, right? We're doing a lot of that. And then now they're coming into CrossFit, need that mobility. And they're having issues with that. So it's like, all right, we got to stretch out the pecs. But first, I find a lot of times actually the stability is the key first. And so I'll have people do that kind of stuff, like if they're super lit up, like the irritation with the balloons. And then I'll actually get, like, I had one guy this morning, I had him just with a dumbbell or kettlebell, just kind of doing overhead presses, and then some squats, or some squats, and then also a little bit like mini ones, and then some lunges just to get that perturbation involved, just for like that end range stability in that overhead. And then I'll also do it with pulling. So I'll have people hold on to like a pull-up bar and they're in that pulling position and just doing like scap depression, kind of that. I almost think of it as a kip too, is like bringing your head through and like slowly scap retraction, protraction, just slowly getting that glide together while pulling. So I think those are some of my go-tos off the bat for stability, for sure. I think those are cool.
Yeah, I like those. Those are really good ones. Probably my go-tos for overhead strength and stability that I use for my athletes are I love waiters walk, so arm fully overhead, holding a weight. I'm a big fan of Turkish get-up variations, just being at end range, going through different movements. I like windmill variations, just holding a dumbbell overhead, going down, touching a toe, back and forth. I'm also a big fan of just specific Olympic lifting to improve shoulder strength. So I'm a big fan of snatch balances because it's going to really replicate the same forces of the bottom part of a snatch. I think those are amazing. Same thing with overhead squatting, just making sure we incorporate some of that. I also think just adding some pauses in different positions can be really, really helpful for building stability. So let's say I'm doing jerk work. If I just pause at the top for a second, I'm helping to build that range of motion, you know? I love jerk recoveries. So just going up underneath of a heavy barbell set nice and high and just locking out the weight. So basically starting in a split position or a power position and standing up with the weight and then dipping down just a little tiny bit and then coming right back up again. So you're just working on that pure lockout. Because I think, like we said, I think people do get injured at end ranges because end ranges are most challenging on the joint. What I think becomes really challenging is that we have to prepare that position as much as we possibly can without doing too much, because we certainly can overdo it, and then we end up with a problem on our hands as well. So it's just trying to balance those as much as possible.
That actually is really cool because I when you talk about, like, I was joking with some of the guys that were filming when we were doing the stuff for this, and I tell people that actually I find when I do snatch work, my shoulders feel the best afterwards, right? Like when I'm done, my shoulders, I was like, oh, I feel nice and loose, I feel great, like I feel, because now I'm warmed up, I'm stabilized, right? Like I feel good afterwards. Versus, like, I was like, you shouldn't have more pain after you do that. Like it should be actually more like, fatigue is one thing, right? And soreness is another, right? Of course. But like that feeling of, I'm like, oh, I feel good now. Like I usually feel better after snatch and overhead work. That's why I like it. And I tell point like too, I go, if in doubt, go stricter, right? So like if particularly like when you talk about like a snatch, then I like, if someone's like, oh, I'm having pain with that, I'm like, well, let's see your overhead squat. Right? Let's take the element of the actual pull overhead. Let's just go nice and easy, get it overhead, and then squat down and see what it looks like, right? And then snatch balance, one of my favorite, right? Such an underutilized position, I think, because especially when someone who's like trying to push performance, right? Because it's like, well, if you can, I got one of my favorite complexes is to snatch balance, then do two overhead squats after, and then that way, now we can start to like play around with it. In terms of that, and now try and go snatch. It's like, oh well, now it feels nice and easy because now you've just practiced that movement, right? I think that's awesome, and so I think too it works on both the combination of range of motion and you're contracting that musculature in that end range of motion, so you're thereby like kind of stabilizing it also. No, I think that's awesome, and I think the waiters walks. What's cool, and we didn't even talk about this, but one of the compensations that I see the most commonly with like an overhead movement like a snatch is how many times will you see like the snatch press? But I even grabbed it, but it's like you're here and then right, like you'll just throw and I'll get here at like the last press. So it really helps with that idea of like I'm just gonna lock out, get that clean motion. Like I'm not gonna get that little press. And sometimes I think to teach people that like where terminal elbow extension is, right? Like almost like a quad lag on an ACL. Like if I think of it as that like-minded joint that like I'll almost get it here and then I'll press it. And I think a lot of people will be like, well, I can accomplish the movement. So on a power snatch, I can do it quickly. But on a big squat snatch, as I'm improving my performance, I can't get there. I can't get that end range, that extension there. So I think all those are awesome ways to work on it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because I've had people, I mean, I guess I was thinking, I've had people like walk with a waiter's walk like that before and be like, no, like get that way. And they go, oh, I've never done that before. Oh, this is so much more challenging, right? It's like, well, yeah, 'cause now I'm on your cuff. I'm not, and no wonder your biceps hurts, right? Like you're sitting in that position, right? So, no,
Yeah.
cool. Cool, man. Well, anything else to add? I know I've kept you here a while. Anything else you want to touch on with that?
No, I do think that it's important, and this is challenging, but before we do all the stability work, I do think it's important to get that mobility first, you know. And I know that we talked a little bit about what maybe limits you, but trying to, let's say, assess the thoracic spine, pecs, lats, maybe it's the shoulder joint itself, maybe the scapula is not moving appropriately. You want to get that mobility first, right? And then once you have that mobility, then you want to try to stabilize that end range. And last piece is you got to layer in your Olympic weightlifting on top of that. And what I tend to do is maybe once or twice a week work on specific stabilization exercises overhead, and then just make sure that my snatch work week to week is very consistent. And if I want to make a change, it's a very small change, and I very slowly progress over the course of time. And I also have periods throughout the course of the year where I kind of unload that shoulder, because I don't know if doing super heavy snatch and jerk work year round is what the shoulder is designed to do. So it's definitely a balancing act.
That is so well put. I mean, it's you know, you got to walk, you got to crawl before you walk, right? Like in terms of the mobility, like it doesn't make sense to work on a stabilizing motion if you can't achieve that motion, right? So I remember the first time I actually ever CrossFit coach was one of the things where I was practicing way back when I was practicing overhead squat, and I was like, oh, I just don't think I have the mobility to get there. And he was like, no, I think you have the mobility because you can do it with a PVC pipe, but as soon as you get a barbell underneath it, you can't get there. And I was like, that is a really good point, right? Like that makes total sense to me. That would absolutely be. So under load, right, all of a sudden things start to crumble. That's a stability issue. But if you start unloading, to your point, and you can accomplish all of the different CrossFit movements. You know, that's why I think CrossFit, like PVC pipes to me, are one of the best things that I've integrated in my practice from CrossFit, right? It's like, hey, if you can't achieve a power clean, good front, we didn't even talk about front rack position. We do a whole nother live on that. But in terms of front rack position, if you can't get in that position with PVC pipe, or you can't get your arms back there on a back squat and engage your lats, like there's a mobility issue with the PVC pipe that we need to be working on, right? Versus us even getting under a barbell. And I think that's challenging for people, right? Like that's hard, man. Like that's a good thing to ask. Like how do you challenge that with a member, right? So if a member's like, listen, I back squat 400 pounds, because you know it's typically that guy, right? Sometimes like,
Yeah.
you know, not the stereotype, but it's usually that beast who can back squat 400 pounds. And it's like, look, today we're working overhead squat. You're going to sit in the corner with the PVC pipe and work on mobility for 10 minutes while everybody else is overhead squatting. You know, like that
Yeah.
is a hard conversation to have, man. Like and so I think naturally sometimes happens. So we pull that out of programming, right? It's like, all right, well, we'll just want overhead squat, right? And it's a shame because it's a really good thing to have in there. So I think sometimes, like, I don't know, how do you approach that with people? That's great to talk about.
Well, I think for an athlete, right? I mean, the big thing for an athlete is that they really pride themselves in how much weight they can lift, right? It's a big part of who they are. Huge sense of their self is how strong they are in the gym, how they look to other people in the gym, how much weight they put on the bar. So if you're taking that away from them, it can be, you know, harmful, right? They don't like that, and they see you as like a poor coach, like I'm going somewhere else and do what I want to do. So I think you have to be really careful with those folks. You know, I don't want to sit them in the corner and be like, I'm smart, you're stupid, you need to work on this. Even if you are completely right as a coach or a physical therapist, I usually frame it as in working your weaknesses. Be like, if you really want to get your snatch better and you got a 400-pound squat, like, dude, if you have the right mobility, you would snatch 300 pounds, right? Or something along those lines. So just educating and just let them know, like, man, you're going to be super strong, but this is very, very important for you. So yeah, we'll still squat heavy. We'll do that. But you're certainly going to have to work on your mobility. And there's periods of time where you're not squatting when everyone else is, because you know what? They're way weaker than you are. You know, you don't need to squat as much. You need to mobilize more. And if you do this, you're ultimately, a year from now, going to be way further ahead than if you decide to keep doing what you're doing now, which is rocking through terrible looking overhead squats and snatches because your mobility stinks, you know?
I like that a lot, actually. The idea of, hey, you're not squatting because they're behind you, you're ahead, right? So this is where your weakness is. We got to work on that. That's awesome. That's actually a great way to put it, right? So it's like almost like it's a way to educate. I think that's huge for sure.
Yeah, it's hard. You know, at the end of the day, you're always going to have people that maybe don't like what you have to say and go somewhere else. But if you can be on their side as much as possible and stay positive and try not to disagree with the person over and over again, you know, for the sense of being right. I always ask myself, you know, and a lot of times this happens afterwards because you don't think about it on the spot when you're speaking with someone, am I saying this because it builds my ego, right? Or am I saying it because it actually helps that person? And I think a lot of times you're just saying it because you want to be more right. You know, I want to be more right than this person in front of me. I know what's best, you know. But at the end of the day, it's like you're trying to help someone, and just saying things that make them mad so you can see more right is just, it's not helpful, you know?
You're so right, because that's actually something that I've tried to, as I've gotten older and more experienced in this. That is something I used to do so much in the beginning, right? Is like I used to try and impose my will of being right on somebody, right? And that, listen, that
Yeah.
never walk away, right? It's not like it's not going mentality's going to work. But now it's more of like, well, how can I reframe this in a way, because sometimes, I always see the disconnect of like you're coaching somebody and then they're going to come see you. Hey, when you're doing this position, do it this way. Otherwise, you're going to have a shoulder issue. And then sure enough, they end up coming to see you for a shoulder issue, and they're like, well, I have a feeling I know what is the cause here. So I think
Hmm.
trying to figure out safe and easy ways to do that without exactly right, like boosting my ego, right? It's like, how can I'm trying to help you do this better, right? So then they all of a sudden do it more efficiently and quicker. And no, for sure. The intention, right? To come back to that a lot of times.
Yeah, it's hard, especially I think in the weight room, because for coaches and for athletes, they're used to just, I don't know, being bullheaded and pushing forward, and that's what's caused success in their life. They try to continue with that sometimes with the people they work with, and works for some people, and other people it just push them away. So I agree with you. I was like that, and I still do that some, and I try to keep working on it. You know, I think it's natural for humans to do that, so it's tough. You're fighting against your natural instinct, but yeah, it's important.
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely agree. I definitely agree. And it's funny because it's something where like now having worked with like a whole range of spectrum of athletes, so some people are more receptive than others, right? Some are more coachable, right? Like some are just so it really depends on that kind of stuff for sure. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, listen, it was awesome. We've been about 45 minutes. It was great.